Buy now, pay later is actually solving a lot of the consumer issues. It is actually disrupting the way people are able to buy on credit and ultimately pay later for those purchases.
Welcome to another episode of Inside the Vacuum, where we go through war stories of people founding fintechs, working in the vacuum of space and time to build something cool, something unique, and something that brings value to the world. And today I'm super excited to have Michal Smida, the CEO of Twisto. Welcome, Michal.
Hey guys, great to be here.
Thank you. So for those who've never heard of Twisto, what's the elevator pitch? What's Twisto and why does the world need Twisto?
So look, great question. I do get asked many times by investors. So obviously you have many great fintechs in the world. You have PayPal, you have Klarna, you have Revolut, which everybody heard about. And we are basically the combination of these guys and playing it on a local market. So we're focusing on Central and Eastern Europe, and our mission is to deliver the best daily payments experience. So one-click payments online, then we provide customers with a virtual, physical card, so Apple Pay, Google Pay. And ultimately, our mission is really driven by delivering the best daily payments experience. And what makes us very unique is that every transaction that a customer makes, they make with Twisto money. So we are actually the ones financing all those purchases on behalf of the customer. So very different to Revolut, where you need to prepay the money to start using the product. Here, we actually give you money to spend on your daily purchases. And then we give you a choice how you want to pay for it every month. You can pay for it now, later, or with installments. So we give you a full freedom to pay for your daily spending. So what really makes us unique is the omni-channel payments experience, where we really cover the wide spectrum of daily payments that you make as a customer. And we're uniquely combining and giving you the full freedom to decide how you want to pay. And that is what really makes us unique, is that you control how you pay for things. And we don't force you to decide when you make that actual purchase. You can decide a month later or maybe in a week's time. So really the most flexible and user-friendly daily payments wallet. That was longer than the 1-minute elevator pitch, but hopefully it's done the trick.
So is it really like a supercharged credit card in terms of the daily operations that people would do with it?
In a way it is. The underlying principle of Twisto is credit card or credit. And the one thing about our region of Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, and even Romania, where we will be expanding soon, is that credit cards are not really the flavor of the month. So many people confuse credit card for a debit card. And when you say you're a credit card, the natural thing is that people will say, I don't need credit, I have money. So that's why we are positioning it more as a daily payments wallet, where credit is really a function or a feature of the app. And ultimately, it also helps us kind of onboard the customer. And it makes it much easier because, look, we will give you the money and you can spend it. We will not ask you to send us any money to start using the product. So we see it as a great feature how we can onboard customers. And ultimately, they are not taking any risk with us. They just, give us a couple of IDs, we onboard them, and then we give them money to spend. But yes, it is a credit card on steroids, in simple words.
You said that they're not sort of taking risk, but since you're working at credit, you're obviously taking on a lot of risk because people are using your money or money that they don't have potentially and spending it. How are you mitigating that risk for yourselves?
Yeah, so this is a big topic in the company ever since we founded Twisto. And we took a very different approach to banks. So typically, when you go to a bank, you need to provide bank statements, proof of employment, proof of salary, a lot of paperwork, and it's just a lot of hassle for the customer. Sometimes they even want to see you physically in a bank branch. So we said, let's score the clients on the basis of their online fingerprint. So with our buy now, pay later solution, we actually see for many of the clients what purchases they're making online, on which e-commerce sites, and that gives us a lot of data. So we are utilizing online shopping data from the customer. Second, we are using data relating to the technical device of the client. So if you're using an iPhone or Android or PC or Mac, that's another piece of information that we use to score you. The third one is your geolocation data. So we get a lot of data from Google Open API, where we can see that on the street where you live, where is the closest park, restaurant, or how far away are you from the city center. And I know these little pieces of information might sound insignificant, but when you combine it with the online shopping, device data, and the geolocation data, it gives you a pretty good picture about a customer. And then the fourth pillar is we do look into credit bureaus because we're a regulated entity. So we need to check if you owe money anywhere. And on the basis of those four things, we're able to decide very quickly if we want to do business with you or not. So it's powered by AI, which is a bit of a buzzword, but we did start with very simple models that banks use. And over the past 7 years, we truly developed an AI platform which takes all this data and delivers a credit decision in a couple of milliseconds.
So it's almost like you build two things. You build the Twisto product for the customer, but then you build this actual internal magic that powers this credit decisioning, right?
That is correct. We actually call the risk engine a Nikita. I don't know if you remember the TV series Brutal Nikita. So that's how we named the risk engine. We also offer the risk engine to third parties. So that's banks, lending institutions, but even e-commerce sites who want to do online deferred payments or loans. They can actually implement Nikita and use it as a service in addition to credit bureau data that they already collect. So we actually offer it as a service as well.
So we now know what Nikita comes from, the name. So where does Twisto come from?
So look, there's unfortunately not a great story behind it, but it was with our CPO, Lucas. It was late in the evening. We were going to get some KFC, and they have this twister, which is a wrapped chicken and a tortilla. And we kind of like the dynamic of that word. And we said, look, we're actually twisting the way people pay. We're changing the dynamic. So putting a bit of a twist behind it. And that's how the kind of name came about. We did have many other ideas, but the domains were either taken or expensive. So Twisto is the one we stuck with. And it's been working ever since.
You said you went out for that KFC. Was that the times when you were initially thinking about Twisto as a product, or did the idea for Twisto come about earlier than that?
So I spent approximately 11 years abroad, living in the US, Russia, then London. And I was in investment banking for 3.5, almost 4 years. And I always had a vision of doing something on my own and starting a company. I always had very close to finance. And I saw these great companies such as Klarna and PayPal really making a difference in Western Europe. And I thought it would be actually amazing to do something like this in Eastern Europe. So kind of bringing what I saw in the West and bringing it to the East. And that was the initial idea. And then around it, I built a team. It was initially 4 guys, just development and product. Actually, a lot of them work with you guys and Vacuumlabs, so you know them. And basically the idea at the time was very different than what we are doing today. Idea number 1 was to tackle online payments. So we introduced a buy now, pay later service. Again, very similar to Klarna, which to some extent was an inspiration. And the first 2 years of the company life cycle, we were building out the product, building the technology, and we were very much a B2B focused company, basically mainly focusing on integrating with big e-commerce merchants. And then approximately 2015, 2016, we started thinking about how can we actually be more relevant for the customer and ultimately capture the daily wallet and daily spending. And that's how the account and the card and the app came about.
So the geographical start in Czech Republic and then Poland and Slovakia partially and Romania, was that a specific choice, or was it just we're from here and it's a nice enough similar market to the West to get started?
That was pretty much it. So I mean, Klarna is a huge global player. At the time, they were in Sweden, in Germany, going into UK. Now they're in the US. So we thought that there's a lot of competition in the West, really well-funded fintechs in there. But many times the Central and Eastern Europe, which if you count all the countries and population together, it's actually the same size as the UK. And that's actually pretty appealing. So we thought it's quite a nice regional niche where we want to become a number 1 player. And ultimately, we want to play a local game. So that's kind of still the story and still the mission that drives us. However, in order for us to kind of get our place under the sun, we will probably look into expansion into Western Europe and some markets there to capture the bigger market potential than what we see in Central and Eastern Europe.
You mentioned that you're basically a buy now, pay later platform. And that's something that is really growing in the industry, is growing in the region. It is a new way of positioning what were traditionally credit cards or credit products and making them much more transparent and much more easy to understand for customers. So why did you choose to go this route? What was the reasoning behind going in particular in this direction with the product?
When we were starting Twisto mid 2013, we first made a very conscious decision to focus on Central and Eastern Europe. So basically the markets where there was very little international competition. We also felt that many of the traditional consumer finance companies were incredibly old school in terms of the processes, the pricing, and the transparency. And also we saw that there's a big penetration of cash on delivery payments in e-commerce. And we thought this is completely crazy because you're ultimately buying something online and then you're paying with cash. So these were kind of some of the things that we saw in the market that we operate in. And at the time, we actually got quite a bit of inspiration from Klarna. So that's kind of the probably global number one player in buy now, pay later. Then there were other companies like Afterpay and ZipMoney. Together, the three of them are probably the biggest now globally. Also, I should not forget PayPal with their Bill Me Later solution. So we actually saw that globally, these solutions actually work incredibly well. They have a very good traction from the merchants, where they're really helping merchants drive sales, supporting customers buying bigger purchases and paying over time or later. And we thought this would be actually a great solution to bring to our region. As I mentioned, traditional players doing a very bad job, cash being a dominant payment method. And we thought that buy now, pay later is actually solving a lot of the consumer issues. It is actually disrupting the way people are able to buy on credit and ultimately pay later for those purchases. So for us, it was really getting some inspiration that we saw internationally and ultimately bringing that model to Central and Eastern Europe with a lot of tweaks. So we were not copying one by one, but tweaking the model so it actually works in the local context of the countries that we operate in.
What makes the local markets different from what you've seen out there?
I think we operate in a slightly more difficult market. I think for two reasons. Number one, if I look at West or even Asia or Australia, where some of the other guys are playing, the level of default or customer risk is much higher in our region. The number of people that don't pay on time or they don't pay at all. Also, some of the best software companies and fraud companies are founded in our region because you just have a lot of people really trying things and trying to find a loophole in the system. So you really have a lot of people culturally who want to try things and they want to try the limit of those things. So ultimately, you're facing an environment where customers are sometimes very creative, and you also have to be very creative in catching fraud or managing the credit risk. And we talked about Nikita as well, and how we try to do that through Nikita, our risk engine. So I think we operate in cultural environments where finding a loophole is sometimes, they pat you on the back and like, well done. Second, when we look at, or generally e-commerce, on this side, actually, we are incredibly developed. You have very big competition from some international players. There are some very big local players. And none of those merchants are willing to pay fees for payments. So there was a big shift over the past, let's say, 5 to 7 years, moving into online payments, customers paying with cards. There have been some innovative interbank payments. And all of these solutions have been provided to merchants at a very low cost. So if you come there with a buy now, pay later solution and you ask the merchant to pay a higher margin or higher fee for the payment, let's say 2-3%, they typically say, look, I can, my customers can pay with a card and they pay a much lower fee, or they can use an interbank transfer and they also pay a much lower fee. Why is this different? If you look at West, merchants typically are willing to pay much more, let's say between 4 to 5% from the purchase amount to the likes of Klarna, Afterpay, or ZipMoney. So basically, there's a culture where merchants are willing to pay in the West, but in the East, not many merchants are actually willing to pay for the buy now, pay later service. Not that they don't believe in it, but they just compare it to the other payment methods. So you're facing an environment which is highly competitive on the payment side. Over the past 5 years, it really became very competitive. And also you're facing a slightly higher risk. So you need to be really creative on the product side, how you shape the product, but you also need to be very good in risk management and selecting the right customers.
So it is very much about this part of the world being very creative in how they approach credit and try to trick the system. So your product is not only about providing that credit, but also providing the credit to those that really deserve it, as opposed to those who might be able to trick the system.
Yeah. And look, I'm not saying that every customer wants to find a loophole. The vast majority of customers are very good customers. They do pay us on time. But I would say there is a bigger minority than in the rest of the world which really tries to find a way through the system. It's very different when you do business in Germany or Poland. I mean, mindset and cultural kind of view on the world is very different. And that ultimately also impacts the product setup, the service provision, and also kind of the legal basis for operating the product.
Yes. So when you look at this from the perspective of the customer, what are the biggest benefits to this sort of buy now, pay later scheme? Is it the convenience? What part of it makes it now the next cool thing?
What was interesting that during COVID, probably the biggest bonanza has been obviously seen in e-commerce. So people flocking to even buying groceries online, which they before thought never possible. And now actually, it works and I get the things delivered in good quality. And with that, actually, you have a new wave of buyers online. The buy now, pay later provides that extra level of security. So number one, it's incredibly simple. It's a one-click payment, and you only really pay for the things once you have it delivered and you are really happy with it. So I think it's a really big layer of security. It's a big layer of trust. There is no fear in buying things online, and that's really kind of on an unconscious level. And the other component is ultimately we are financing those purchases for, let's say, 14 to 30 days. So there's also the aspect of credit and being able to defer the payment or maybe spread it into several months. And if you make it really simple and transparent for the customer, even during the times of COVID, where some people might have lost their job or might have some delayed payments from suppliers, having the ability to defer the payment interest-free, it's actually an incredible value added for the customer. So I think it really comes down to ease of use, super simple one click, super secure, and I can really, I don't need to fear buying anything online. And the third component is actually, look, I can decide when I want to pay within an interest-free period. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. So do you already have a vision for where this market or this sort of way of purchasing will evolve and how it will get better in the future?
Sure. So I think globally, buy now, pay later is much more accepted. I think in Germany and Sweden, it can account to, let's say, 30 to 50% of e-commerce and all payments. I think in our part of the world, it's still under 5%. So in Central and Eastern Europe, I think there's still a big room to grow. And I do believe that in the next, let's say, 5 years, buy now, pay later could be 20 to 30% of all online payments. So I think there's a big room to grow in terms of penetrating big merchants, but also penetrating a wider customer audience. I think what we see a big shift is, and hopefully we'll also bring it to our part of the world, is ultimately giving the customer the option to pay over several months. So not the 14 to 30 days interest-free, but ultimately buying new shoes for 200 euros, paying over 3 months interest-free, where the merchant is actually subsidizing the interest because they have a bigger conversion. Customers typically buy more, and it hugely increases the customer satisfaction. So they're willing to pay up the margin. So for us, the next step is introducing interest-free installments and allowing customers to pay for bigger purchases over time interest-free. And that's ultimately where we see the industry heading. We see it's working very well for Klarna, Zip Money, and Afterpay. And we ultimately want to bring this model to Central and Eastern Europe as well.
Exciting. So it's really about removing friction on both ends, both for the customer, but also for the merchants who want to sell more. So they enable that purchase much quicker.
100%. And I think on one part, the friction is around the checkout. So really making super simple mobile one-click experience in an ideal world. And then ultimately, it's also about working with merchants and making sure they are willing to give us some money so we can make it interest-free and free of charge for the customer. So I think it's kind of on both ends, is making sure that merchants are willing to share the margin because they get a lot of benefit from the service. And ultimately that allows us to make it super convenient and super cheap for the customer.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting the way you talked about it a moment ago, that especially sort of here in Central Europe or the sort of post-communist era country, they might not be as used to using credit cards per se. But twisting that name or twisting that definition of what credit can mean can be very helpful. And I guess Klarna is already doing that in the West. Like a lot of what they're doing has that feel to it. Like you're just paying for stuff. Like whether you're paying for this, whether it's coming out of your bank account now or 15 days from now or 6 months from now, that's almost a decision that we're giving over to you, right?
Yes, correct. So again, Klarna has done an amazing job. I mean, establishing the buy now, pay later as a term, globally, and definitely they have left some large shoes for us to fill. So definitely someone we look up to.
Absolutely. One thing that you said that was interesting was the fact that you're now using Nikita as not only your own decisioning engine, but also selling it to third parties. So if somebody's listening to this and saying like, "Oh, this is something that might be useful to me," like, what does that collaboration look like? How do you start working with them? What types of partners are you talking to there?
To be honest, this was a bit of a weekend project. So it's not something that it's a core focus of myself or the team. I think we have around 15 clients. 30 of them are in Czech Republic. And basically, mainly looking at financial institutions who are doing lending or e-commerce players such as Alza, which is one of the biggest e-commerce players in Czech. They actually build an in-house lending capability and they do it on their own with their own balance sheet. And the way it works, we basically offer an API-driven service where we become part of their checkout or part of their process. And within milliseconds, we're able to score the clients and via API return a score. So it's a super simple process, a simple integration, and that's how we offer it to third parties. So we're really solving for first online fraud. So making sure we identify the customers correctly, and that's what Nikita is really good in, and really enriching the data sources that those parties work with, because they work with traditional data sources, employment, how much money they are making, and they look at credit bureau data. We are able to give them a completely different data set and view on the client. And that's actually what they find really exciting and adding a lot of value.
Is this only for regular people or also for companies?
So it is for regular people, for humans. We don't score companies. I think that's a completely different ball game, kind of scoring SMEs. So it is really kind of individual people. It can be also freelancers, but mainly it is for human beings.
There's lots of them, so I guess you'll be okay. And of course, the SME business is large. There's lots of opportunities there, but also the complexity is so much bigger, like you said, that it's not easy to do so.
Yes.
Wonderful. As you know, I'm from Vacuumlabs. I'm even wearing the shirt here. And we're very happy and glad that you're a customer of ours for quite some time now. Can you talk a little bit about how we got started and what the collaboration has looked like so far?
Yeah, sure. We were always against outsourcing or putting IT outside of the walls of our office. What I started the dialogue with when I met you guys, I think it was about 2-3 years ago. But what has really changed our mind and kind of led to us working with you and having several people and actually thinking about enlarging the team at Vacuumlabs is that, number one, the people that work with us at Vacuumlabs are incredibly smart, intelligent, but also very senior people. So when we were 2-3 years ago looking at the market, it was very tough to hire senior people, and you actually had those people. So for us, it was an immediate boost to our development capacity by having people who have long experience, who are not juniors, who know what they're doing, and almost from within a couple of days or weeks, they were able to add value. So I think it was really about the guarantee of quality of developers that you guys have been sourcing and then making available to us. So I think really quality of people is something that has surprised us and has been number one factor. Number two, it's ultimately that the team at Vacuumlabs is fully dedicated to Twisto. So it's not kind of, some 5 guys in Slovakia working for us, but actually these people have become an integral part of Twisto. And it almost just feels like we have an office in Bratislava, which is managed by some nice people who take care of the office space, the coffee, and the things we, don't need to take care of. So ultimately it became an extension of Twisto. And that was very different to when we spoke to other companies where it was pure body shop, where you have a couple of guys, they sometimes change from time to time. So really having that dedicated team was important to us. Third one, we do face several kind of ad hoc projects that we get excited about. And having someone like Vacuumlabs allows us to, call up the lead guy, the project manager, and say, look, we would love to have another 2-3 guys. Would you be able to give them to us in the next couple of weeks? And usually you say yes, which is good. So for some ad hoc kind of things that you would never be able to do in-house or hire very quick, we actually have you guys, and we know that you're fairly flexible in providing talented guys that we can use for the project. So yeah, it really came down to having senior talent, fully dedicated to Twisto, and also having flexibility and adding some more capacity in case we need it. And look, it can be calling you up on, in March saying, look, we need a couple more guys. And in April, you're working on a project. And I think that's, for us, is actually a big benefit.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. I mean, alongside this podcast, we're putting out a short case study describing some of the work we've done together. Is there something that comes to mind when you're thinking about the work we've done together that was special, or something that you're really proud of that we were able to achieve together?
Sure. So I think one big initiative for us was launching an installment product. Within the app, when you make a purchase, you can go to the detail of the transaction and you can spread the payment over 12 months. Super simple for the consumer. And we have actually fully outsourced this function. It's been actually completely run on the development side by you guys. So there was basically one project where we said, we need to get it done in 3 months. And you actually delivered it in 3 months. So surprisingly, it never happens, but we managed to get it done within the timeline. And again, that for us was a huge help. And we fully relied on the guys delivering within the timeline, and that actually happened. As I said, we take the guys as an integral part of Twisto. We do very well, I think, in managing the timelines, the deliveries. The guys are on Slack 24/7 with us, almost 24/7. But I think this was one project where we could really see kind of the power of the output of the team. And again, we see them as an extension of our team, and the delivery has been impeccable.
Thank you, Michal. Switching over gears to a slightly different topic, we've just passed 50% progress on 2020. We've seen at least one or two big events happen in this whole time, whether it's COVID or some of the sort of fintech providers being disrupted, not working correctly. What has been the thing that surprised you the most over the past 6 months? What has been the thing like this is something that I really did not expect would happen?
So regarding the past quarter, and I think for many it's been a black swan. I mean, who the hell could have predicted that the whole world will be on a lockdown? So I think that in itself was, a huge shock. But secondly, what happened due to corporate governance at Wirecard, that actually one of the biggest processors and fintechs in Europe went from a 24 billion valuation to zero and insolvency, and actually losing a license for 4 days, which ultimately resulted in Twisto, one of Twisto's products, not working properly for 4 days. We fortunately had a backup solution, so we were able to really switch clients in a very short period of time. But it was kind of a big shock. Who would have imagined that one of the biggest fintechs and banks would actually collapse in a matter of a week and would get their license from a UK regulator being actually postponed or actually revoked for a couple of days. So this was probably even a bigger black swan than the COVID itself, potentially. And the Wirecard actually impacted approximately 5 million card customers in Europe and approximately 65 fintechs. And I think we're still yet to see the impact of that on the fintech industry. Ultimately, some client funds were held within Wirecard and customers could not really access those funds. And I think there could be some ripple effect in terms of reputational damage to fintechs as stable institutions that are in some cases holding customers' money either in the form of deposits or prepaid cards. And I think it could be some damage to fintechs in Europe. So that's yet to be seen. And hopefully it will not be that bad.
Absolutely. This is going to be such a broad question, but I'm curious on how you're going to answer it. So you're playing in a particular part of the fintech industry, and you said that some fintechs might have been shaken up by this current situation with Wirecard. We'll see what the impacts are down the line. But where do you see sort of maybe 10 years down the line fintechs will be? Is there some part of the big mission of Twisto that is leading towards something much bigger? Or is there something in the entire industry that you see will blow up?
So I'll also approach it very broadly and maybe from many aspects. And maybe looking at the Wirecard example as such, I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call to many of the fintechs that you cannot rely on other fintechs for stability. So I think many of the fintechs, in order to really build trust among customers, they need to show a robust technical and security solution. So I think fintechs will either need to move to full in-house solutions, really show that they have it under control and they're not reliant on third parties for provision of core payment services. And I think that's one big learning for us as well. And we have actually moved a big part of the payment card issuing in-house and are only using a third party for processing. So I think 10 years down the line, fintechs will ultimately need to become more robust. And to be honest, I mean, we sometimes make fun of banks that they're really huge and not really flexible. But I think in order for us to become as credible as banks, we need to be very robust as well. And in case there's an outage of one, we'll have a second, option and really make sure there's a continuity in providing customer service. because if you send an email on Friday night, you will not be able to access your funds to a client. I mean, that's a horrible service. And that actually happened to 65 fintechs in Europe with the outage of Wirecard. And that was just one example. So to your question, fintech in the next 10 years, I think there's always been a debate, fintech versus bank, where at the beginning it was ultimately fintech is there to kill banks, but soon we realized it's actually not that easy and that banks will remain here. And I think in the next 10 years, we'll see more and more cross collaboration or working together between a bank and a fintech. We see it in our case where part of Twisto is owned by ING Bank out of Netherlands. We actually created a product together in Poland. And I think we'll see more and more partnerships between a bank and fintech in servicing clients. And I think that's not only on the payment side, but also there are some things that fintechs are just not able to do, such as giving a big mortgage to a customer or really financing a huge purchase over a long period of time. So I think banks will remain and fintechs will try to find ways how they can service their clients in a more fulsome way, perhaps utilizing some of the bank's offering and collaborating with them in servicing those clients. And I think in the next 10 years, it will be very formative in fintechs being sizable partners to banks and banks also realizing that fintechs are really an interesting partner to have.
Absolutely. What you said is that some fintechs will need to think about sort of redundancies and backup providers and that sort of thing. Is that really commercially feasible, or will it just have to be?
Probably fintechs will be more scrutinized by investors. So when there's a due diligence, I did not get that many questions on IT, or if Wirecard fails, what are you guys going to do? And I think it's going to not only come from the fintech founders who want to deliver a sustainable service, but I can also imagine the investors asking more questions on it and thereby being willing to use some of that money towards infrastructure. So I think it will become increasingly important for investors. If it's important for them, it will also be easier to invest into infrastructure. And then ultimately, the founder needs to find the right balance between infrastructure-focused IT versus launching and developing new features. So yes, I think it will be more costly, more resources allocated to this. And I think founders will be under more pressure to really show that, look, I have a plan B in case this supplier fails. And before Wirecard, nobody would probably question you on it. After this, probably everybody was going to question you on that.
So it's going to bring up new questions during that due diligence process. And I mean, for you guys, you were already in the process of moving over a lot of that into Marqeta, right? That's what really saved you in that situation.
So we've been very lucky that we actually had a backup solution. We were planning to leave Wirecard in any event. This only accelerated that migration. We learned about the outage on Friday, 1 o'clock. And on Friday, 8 p.m., customers could already be ordering new cards or getting virtual cards in the Twisto app and ultimately could be already using Twisto from Friday evening. So right now we are kind of recarding the whole portfolio, sending new physical cards, which are actually a very nice design. I wish I have shown you one here. And we also have a fully digital virtual card that customers can immediately activate in the app. So we were very lucky in a very unlucky scenario that we were already in the transition period. But our question also is how Marqeta will be sustainable in the next 5 years. I believe they are, but we also should think about what are the backups in case the processing through Marqeta will fail, in case it ever happens. So we just also need to think about, great that we switch from Wirecard, but what are the next steps in really securing that we run on 100%, even though there might be some outage in the future from a supplier?
Absolutely. I mean, this is going to be on top of people's minds, especially now. And the questions are now going to come up significantly more during that due diligence process. So we're just going to see that, and we're going to need to be ready for it as an industry, really, because after all, as you said, like we might have some negative sentiment towards banks per se, but really what they've been doing very well for, potentially centuries is keeping that money safe and managing privacy to the best possible level they could. So is there anything that I should have asked about Twisto that I didn't, that you definitely want to tell the world about?
So look, I don't want this to be a sales pitch, right? So saying how great we are. No, I think, so when we maybe share maybe a couple of the challenges that we're facing, that probably many of the fintech founders are facing as well. And I'll not be touching on regulation because it's very, region or locally specific. But I think what will be important for us going forward, I think the 2008 crisis, the banks have been part of the problem, and that has actually given rise to fintech as such. What I see now is that actually banks are in a way part of the solution. So disbursing funds to SMEs, giving customers payment holidays, or forgiving some of the late payment fees. And actually, to be honest, banks have done a pretty good job during COVID. I mean, not, they could have done maybe a bit more, but in the eyes of the customers, they've actually done pretty well. So the key challenge for us would be, or not a challenge, but with customers' affinity towards banks, and again, I think their loyalty has skyrocketed through COVID. The key question for us as Twisto for the remainder of the year and going forward is how are we going to position ourselves as a love brand with customers, even though we try to do our best to help customers, but ultimately how to kickstart the growth and make sure that customers will still have a bank account, but ultimately be using Twisto on a daily basis for their payments. And I think there has been a shift in sentiment, customer sentiment. Wirecard is another thing, and we don't want this podcast to be only about Wirecard, but I do think that it might be a little bit tougher to acquire customers going forward. I mean, we do benefit from fully digital onboarding, great app, and really kind of fully transparent, but also banks are moving in the direction. And actually the differentiation between fintech and banks will become potentially smaller over time. So really the key challenge for us is how are we going to be differentiated? How are we going to position the product? And it might actually be slightly different to what we have been doing before COVID. So kind of fine-tuning the USP, the product proposition, but also revising the pricing, because big focus for us right now is that we want to move into a profitable, so we are profitable on unit economics, but we are not profitable on an EBITDA basis, as many of fintechs are. So I think also the key challenge for us will be attracting the right customers, but also making sure that we're able to monetize them and in the foreseeable future be completely self-sustainable and not reliant on venture capital investment.
So I'm very cognizant of your time. I know you have lots of meetings to get to after this. So I'd like to thank you, Michal, for coming on today. It was a very interesting conversation. We touched on a lot of topics. So I'm glad you had your opinions on everything and I could hear what you say about it. For those who want to either know more about Twisto or find out more about you or get in contact with you, what's the best channel to do so?
So more about Twisto, go to twisto.cz or PL or twistopay.com. If you want to get in touch with me, then LinkedIn is the best way. So just add me and I'll be happy to chat.
Well, thank you, Michal. Have a wonderful day and week and year. Hopefully we'll make it through without any other big black swan events, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Marcel. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
I would like to thank everyone for listening. We're back soon with another war story from inside the vacuum.